Let me tell you something. The day I died, a god literally laughed at me. Not a metaphor. An actual god, standing over my body, laughing. I remember the sound, low, satisfied. Like a man who just won a bet he rigged himself from the very beginning. I have been a scholar, not a warrior, not a mage. Just a man who spent 30 years studying how the world actually worked. And in a world where every single person is born with mana, where children summon fire before they learn to walk, I had zero. Not weak mana, not hidden mana, not that your power sleeps within you kind. Zero. Empty. A blank the universe forgot to fill. My name was Kale, and the god who laughed at me was Sorth, god of flame, patron deity of the empire, beloved by kings. He killed me on a Tuesday. I remember because the market was open and I could smell bread baking the streets over. Funny what you notice when you're dying. I opened my eyes in darkness. Not peaceful darkness. The kind that has weight that presses against your eyeballs like it wants inside your skull. My first thought was, so this is death. My second thought was, why does death smell like wet stone and something burning? I sat up, hit my head on a ceiling that had no business being that low. Said a word I probably shouldn't repeat. Then the darkness shifted. Somewhere to my left, something small and orange flickered, a flame tiny, barely the size of my thumbnail, sitting in a crack in the stone wall like it had been waiting. I looked at my hands small thin. The hands of a child maybe 9 or 10 years old, smooth where mine had been scarred from decades of quill and knife work. I was alive. I was young. I was in a hole in the ground, and somehow, inexplicably, I was not afraid. Maybe because I had already died once and fear requires something left to lose. Or maybe my brain just decided to take notes instead. Old habit. The room was barely bigger than a closet. Stone walls, stone floor. A wooden door at the far end with light leaking through the crack. I crawled to it, put my eye to the crack. A corridor. To guards at a table playing cards. Behind them, a staircase going up. Simple enough. I felt along the floor until I found a pebble. Flat on one side. Thin enough. Spent 10 minutes working it under the door and toward the iron bar latch. The guards argued about whether to pair beat a flush. They did not look up. The bar shifted. I caught the door before it could swing and make noise. I slipped through, stayed low, moved to the base of the staircase, went up 2 at a time on bare feet, stepped out into the city, and stood there breathing cold air. Valith, capital of the Arden Empire. The city I had lived in for the last 20 years of my previous life. Now I was 9 years old, and wearing clothes that were slightly too big. No money, no name anyone would recognize, no allies, no mana. I checked, reached inward the way every child learns to. Found the same vast emptiness I had carried my entire first life. Of course, why would death fix the particular problem? I almost laughed. Instead I started walking and thinking, which was more or less what I had always done. There is something interesting about being a child in a city you know as an adult. The scale is wrong. People move past without looking down. Children are invisible in cities like this. Too small to threaten, too common to notice. I took that information away and filed it next to things worth using later. By the end of the first hour, I had found a baker throwing out day-old bread, a water trough, and a drop canvas sack wedged between 2 buildings. By the end of the second hour, I had also found a piece of chalk. Someone had left it on a barrel outside a warehouse. I borrowed it, indefinitely. I found a flat section of stone wall behind an abandoned cooperage and started writing. Not from the beginning. I knew the beginning. I started with a part that had gotten me killed. Here is the thing about magic that every mage knows and almost no one thinks about. It follows rules. Not suggestions. Not tendencies. Actual rules. The same way water flows downhill. The same way fire needs air. Magic had patterns, and patterns had limits, and limits meant that anything magic could do, something else could potentially do instead. That was the idea Sorth had found in my notebooks, and decided was too dangerous to leave walking around. Not that magic could be beaten. Warriors had tried that for centuries. The idea that magic could be replaced. That was the thought Sorth found in my notebooks and decided was dangerous enough to kill over. And he wasn't entirely wrong. I wrote for 3 hours until the chalk was gone. Then I sat back, looked at what I had put on the wall, and thought about scale. The fundamental problem with being a 9-year-old with no mana, no money, no name, and extremely ambitious plans was simple. It was going to take years before I had anything functional. The city hummed around me in the dark. Somewhere in the upper districts, a mage was lighting evening lamps with a gesture, filling the high streets with steady blue-white flame. Down here, people used tallow candles and went to bed early. I looked up at the glow of mage lights above and thought, not forever. The first problem was practical. I needed to exist in this city without drawing attention. Children without places to belong in Valith ended up in workhouses, charity wards, or dead. I had no particular interest in any of those options. There was a fourth one: message runners, water carriers, boys who held horses outside taverns. I spent 3 days learning how it worked. My new body was small but fast. I could run messages across the lower quarter in minutes, and nobody looked twice at a running child. By the end of the first week, I had a root, regular income of small coppers, and assets I cared about more: unrestricted movement through large parts of the city, and complete social invisibility. My name, as far as anyone who asked was concerned, was Ren.Short.Plain. Completely forgettable. Exactly what I needed it to be. 2 weeks in, I had a small room rented for 3 coppers a night from a woman named Dasa who ran a laundry and asked no questions as long as I made no noise after the 8th bell. The room had a window that faced a wall. I considered this an acceptable trade for the cost. More importantly, it had a table, and a table meant I could work. Over the course of running messages, I had identified what I needed most: something better to write with, access to scrap metal sellers, and someone who knew how the city's waste disposal worked. The last one sounds strange. It was the most important. Cities produce waste, and waste tells you things: what people make, what they throw away when they think no one is watching. The eastern waste yards of Valith were where the city's magical infrastructure went to die. Broken focus crystals, burned out channeling rods, mana cells that had run dry and weren't worth recharging. To Image, useless junk. To me, a library waiting to be read. I started visiting on my days off, bringing small coppers each time, until they stopped caring what I poked through. Also copper wire. Also certain mineral deposits that formed in channels where mana had been flowing for years. Strange materials with interesting properties. I kept notes on all of them. Winter came to Valith and the lower quarter got colder than anywhere has any right to be. I ran messages with hands wrapped in cloth and thought about heat generation. Specifically about how to generate it without magic. Everyone here used warming runes, mana-heated stones, personal flames if they had enough power. All of it, actually, quite inefficient when you understood what was actually happening beneath the surface of the spell. There was a better way. I had written about it in the notebook Sorth had burned along with my previous body. The principle was almost embarrassingly simple once you saw it. Fire does not need magic. Fire needs fuel, air, and a start. Magic just replaced the start and convinced people the entire process required mana. It didn't. It never had. On a cold morning in what passed for the second month of winter, I built my first device on a flat stone in the corner of Das's laundry room. It was not impressive to look at. A small clay pot, a controlled air vent carved into the side, a specific arrangement of the waste yard mineral deposits that I had spent 6 weeks testing in carefully measured small amounts. I lit it with a spark from a piece of flint. The heat that came off it was steady, controlled, sustained, and required no mana whatsoever. I sat in front of it for a long time. Dasa came in an hour later, saw the small glowing device, and gave me a look that contained several competing emotions working against each other. "That's not magic," she said. "No," I agreed. "How's it working, then?" "Chemistry," I said. She looked at it for another moment, then she looked at me. I was still, at this point, wearing the body of a 9-year-old child. I was aware that the conversation probably looked somewhat absurd from the outside. "You're a strange child," Dasa said. "Yes," I agreed. She went back to her laundry. The device burned steadily for 6 more hours. I wrote down everything and started the next one. Here is the thing no one in this world understood about science. It compounds. Magic had ceilings. You were born with a certain amount and training could refine it. But most people hit their natural limit by their mid-20s and stayed there. Science had no ceiling. Every device I built taught me something new. Every failure was data. Every small success opened 3 more doors I hadn't seen before. The compounding was the entire point of the method. The focus crystals I had been collecting turned out to have properties with nothing to do with magic and everything to do with physical structure. The angles, the geometry, a lens system. Spectacularly precise, actually. The mages who designed them needed precision and accidentally created something far more versatile than they intended. Classic case of not thinking clearly about your own tools. Their oversight. My advantage. I started building immediately. I built a device that concentrated light, then one that concentrated heat, then one that could start a fire at a distance of 4 meters with no direct contact whatsoever. I tested this behind the waste yard on a piece of wood I had soaked in water first, to make it slow to catch. The device lit it anyway. I sat on a broken crate and watched it burn. An army of mages could start fires. An army of anything with one of my devices could also start fires. The difference: mages were born with their ability. My devices could be built by anyone with scrap material, by anyone willing to learn a short set of instructions, by anyone at all, which was the point, which was always the entire point. I was 11 now, 2 years in Valith, 47 functional devices built, tested, and documented, half destroyed after they taught me everything they could. I kept detailed notes on all of them. I had also, without particularly meaning to, become something of a fixture in the lower quarters and formal network of people who knew things. Not a leader, nothing that visible, but a useful person. The woman who ran water distribution for 3 blocks figured out I was the reason. Her main pipe had stopped leaking. I had watched the leak for a week and plugged it with a compound from waste yard scraps. She didn't know how I had done it. She gave me bread twice a week for a month and told to people who told for more. Small things, but information traveled with them. The cobbler to streets over had tools corroding in the winter damp. I solved it with a surface treatment I had found in a discarded book outside a scholar's house. He fixed my boots for free for a year. I was building a reputation I hadn't planned and couldn't quite stop, which was not the invisibility I had intended. This was, I noted, a problem worth solving carefully. On the morning that changed everything, I turned a corner running a message and walked directly into a procession. Not unusual in Valith, the temples ran processions regularly. Ceremonies, feast days, celebrations of power that were really demonstrations of power wearing the costume of celebration. This one was for Sorith. The god of flame himself had decided to walk his city that morning, and the whole lower quarter had stopped cold to watch. Not in human form. He didn't bother with that. Just a column of fire taller than the buildings, moving slow and deliberate through the streets. People pressed back against walls with the specific expression of those trying to appear worshipful while also trying not to catch on fire. I pressed back with everyone else and looked up. He was large. Gods generally were, not because they needed to be, but because they had learned size communicated power to the humans watching, and gods of this world were very attentive to that. The heat off him was considerable. Even at the edge of the crowd, I felt it pressing against my face like a hand. I looked at the heat and for the first time in 2 years, thought about the notebooks, about the calculations I had been running in my head since the moment I woke up in that cold, dark cell, about what it would actually take to do what I was planning to do. Once, just once, what might have been an eye formed in the flame and seemed to track slowly across the watching crowd. It passed over me without stopping. Still invisible. Good. I delivered my message, collected my copper, went back to my room, and that night looked at 47 devices lined up on a salvage wood shelf, and thought about ceilings. Magic had them. Science didn't, but science had something else, something that magic, for all its extraordinary power, had never really figured out how to build at any scale. Infrastructure. That one word was the answer to everything I had been building toward, and the single thing no god in this world had ever bothered to create. One mage could do extraordinary things. 10 mages could do more extraordinary things. But mages were individuals with egos and ambitions and the complex politics of people who had always been special. My devices didn't have egos. They did what they were built to do, consistently, at any scale, operated by anyone willing to learn a set of simple instructions. That was not a small difference. That was the entire difference. And it was the kind of difference that, at sufficient scale, stops being a difference and starts being a war. I started writing that night on my small precious stack of paper, saved over months of message running, 1 or 2 sheets at a time. I wrote for 6 hours without stopping. When I finished, I had the outline of something I had no name for yet. Not a weapon, not exactly the system. The skeleton of something that had never existed in this world before. And sitting there in Das's laundry building, 11 years old and entirely alone, I felt for the first time since waking in the dark something that was definitely, unmistakably, excitement. The god who laughed at me the day I died had made one mistake. He assumed the only thing worth being afraid of was mana. He had looked at my notebooks, 30 years of careful thought about how power actually worked, and decided the most efficient response was to simply erase me and go back to his comfortable afternoon. What he had not considered was that the thought itself couldn't be erased. The idea existed. It was just a question of who was going to build it. The answer, I was increasingly certain, was me. Outside, Valith hummed its evening hum. In the upper quarter, mages were doing whatever mages did at night, drinking, probably, demonstrating small powers to each other, feeling very secure. I blew out my tallow candle, 3 coppers for a week's supply, not a mono flame, and went to sleep. I had a great deal of work to do tomorrow. The next morning I made the decision that accelerated everything. I needed a teacher. Not for magic, for materials, metal specifically. The next phase required precision I couldn't achieve alone with improvised tools and waste-yard scraps. I needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. The best metalworker in the lower quarter was a woman named Bricks, approximately 60. Forearms like someone who had spent 60 years doing exactly what she did. Workshop that smelled of iron and hot oil. I had been watching her work for 3 months from the alley beside her shop. Not strangely, in the way of someone collecting data. She was extraordinarily good, better than she should have been, in a city where the best work went to mages and non-magical workers were expected to do adequate. She did excellent anyway, because she apparently could not help it. I knocked on her door on a Tuesday morning. She opened it, looked down at me, and said, "You're the child who watches from the alley." "Yes," I said. "Why?" "I'm trying to understand what you're doing." She considered me with an expression of someone deciding whether this was interesting or annoying. "Do you know what I'm doing?" "Mostly. 3 things I haven't worked out yet." That, it turned out, was exactly the right answer. She let me in. I paid for the lessons and solutions. Every week I brought her a problem I had solved, something practical that made her work easier, her materials better, her tools last longer. In return, she taught me things about working metal that I could not have learned alone in a decade. An efficient arrangement. She thought I was some kind of strange prodigy. She was not entirely wrong. For months in, she asked me what I was building. I showed her the 47 devices. She looked at them for a long time, picking several up and turning them over in her hands. She asked questions and I answered every single one without holding anything back. Then she sat down on her stool and looked at me. "These don't use mana," she said. "No, any of them, no. And they work." "Yes." She looked at the shelf for a long moment before she spoke again. She looked at the shelf for a long moment. "Child," she said, "you are either going to change the world or get yourself killed. Ideally the first one," I said. She almost smiled. "Come back tomorrow. I have things to teach you." I came back every single day for the next year without missing once. Between the metalwork and the device testing and the daily messages across Valith, something else was quietly growing in the background. Word travels in places like the lower quarter. Not loudly, not in ways that reach the upper city or the temples or the gods who run things, but in the quiet way that matters more. People were asking about the boy who fixed things without magic, and I was starting to think very carefully about who might want to know the answer to the question. If you had to pick one person to see these devices first, who would it be? Drop it below. I read every single one. Word about me had a way of traveling without being sent anywhere specific. That is the nature of useful things. People talk about them whether you want them to or not. By the time I was 12, 3 different people in the lower quarter had asked me to fix something they'd given up on years ago. A water pump, a grain mill, and a lock. The pump had a cracked housing. The mill's gear system had been grinding wrong for a decade, costing the owner a quarter of every batch. The lock was on a warehouse belonging to a nervous man named Pelth, who had lost the key 6 years prior and apparently never thought to ask anyone about it until now. I fixed all 3. The pump with a compound sealant from waste-yard minerals and rendered fat. The mill with a gear correction that took 2 hours and 1 correctly sized piece of iron. The lock I opened in about 4 minutes, which I told Pelth later was generous. He looked at me strangely and said he'd think about changing the security. He did not change his security. People rarely act on advice that implies effort. But he paid me well and told someone who eventually told a woman named Sev. Sev was the person who changed everything. I need to tell you about her carefully, because she is the kind of person who is easy to describe wrong. She was not a criminal, exactly. Not a merchant, not a gang leader. She was the person in the lower quarter who knew where things were. She was the person in the lower quarter who knew where things were. Not stolen things necessarily, just things. Where grain prices were actually going before announcements. Which guards looked away from which streets on which nights. Which buildings were empty and which only looked at. Information. That was what Seth traded in, and she had been extraordinarily good at it for 30 years. She came to my room one evening while I was in the middle of trying to work out a pressure mechanism for a new device. Knocked once. I opened the door. She was shorter than I expected from her reputation. Somewhere between 50 and whatever age people stop counting. Sharp eyes. The kind of face that had learned not to show what it was thinking. She looked at me, 12 years old, surrounded by devices and notes and bricks' metalwork, and said, "You're the boy who opens locks." Among other things. I said, "What other things?" "Depends who's asking." She almost smiled. "Almost. I'm asking. Then it depends what you need." She came in and sat down without being invited, which told me several things about her right away. All of them useful. She looked at the devices for a long time, picked one up, the heat concentrator, 3rd generation, and turned it over with the careful hands of someone who had handled many valuable things. "This isn't magic," she said. "No." I said. "Does it work?" "Yes." "Could you make more of them?" I looked at her carefully. "How many more?" She put the device down. "As many as you wanted," she said. "Theoretically speaking." "That's not an answer," I said. "Neither was yours," she said back. We looked at each other for a moment. I decided I liked her. She had the quality I most respected in people. The ability to say nothing and mean everything at exactly the same time. "Why?" I asked. Just that one word. And I watched her decide whether to answer honestly or strategically. She chose honestly. I respected that. "Because I have been watching the lower quarter for 30 years, she said. "And I have never once seen it get better. Not for lack of people wanting it to, for lack of tools." She picked up the heat device again. "This is a tool," she said. "A real one, not magic. Not something the mages can shut off when they decide people are getting too comfortable." I had not thought about it in exactly those terms before. I had been thinking about scale and infrastructure and the mechanics of power. Sev was thinking about something more immediate. "You want a distribution network," I said. She nodded once. "I want a lot of things. A distribution network is where you start." She was, I would later understand, about 10 steps ahead of me at that particular moment. She always was. She didn't just see the present problem. She saw the next 5 already solved. I was 12 and I was very smart. But Sev had been doing this for 30 years. She knew the city the way I knew mechanisms, as a system of pressure points and flow. Things that could be redirected if you found the right place to push. She saw the whole board while I was still learning where the pieces were. A useful combination, it turned out. We made an agreement that evening on no paper and with no witnesses. She would provide materials, space, and connections. I would provide devices and the knowledge of how to build them. No money changed hands. That was deliberate. Money could be traced. Favors, she told me, were the currency of people who actually understood how power moved. I thought about that for a long time after she left. About tools and power, and who got to decide which people deserved which things. The work changed after that, not the nature of it. I was still in Briggs's workshop every morning, still testing things in evenings, still running messages as cover. But the scale changed entirely. Sev had access to materials I had only theorized about. Proper iron stock, not waste yard scraps. Specific minerals sourced from outside the city. Tools built for precision rather than improvised from whatever was available. Working with real materials for the first time in this life felt like suddenly being able to see clearly after years of fog. I built a forge in the back of a space Sev controlled, a basement level of a building that appeared, to anyone looking, to be a storage facility for a textile merchant who did not technically exist. Briggs came with me without being asked. I had not told her about Sev. I had not told her about the plan. She had seen the direction the work was going and made her own decision. "You're going to need someone who can actually use a forge properly," she said. "You're good at design. You are not good at the actual hitting things with hammers part." She was not wrong. She was almost never wrong about metal. She also brought to former apprentices, Das, and a young man whose nickname was Ferret, which I eventually stopped asking about. The team, if I could call for people and an invisible information broker a team, took shape over the following months, each person slotting into the gap they were best suited to fill. I designed, Briggs refined, Das and Ferret built. Sev moved finished devices through her network to places in the lower quarter where they would actually be used by people who needed them. Where did they go? Practical places. The water purification device, filtration based on how temple mages clean city reservoirs, minus the magic, went to the 3 worst neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where children got sick from the water supply every single winter without fail. And the city provided exactly 0 assistance because mages did not live there. The heat devices went to the workshop cooperative on the eastern side. 20 small businesses that had been losing workers every winter to cold-related illness. A mechanical grain separator, built into weeks after years of watching the mill owner's problem, went to 5 grain handlers in the lower quarter, tripling efficiency without a drop of mana. I was 12. The devices were being used. The lower quarter was, in small specific measurable ways, becoming slightly less terrible to live in. Nobody had died from the water supply that winter, and nobody above the lower quarter had noticed yet, because nobody above the lower quarter was looking. That was, in retrospect, exactly what I needed. But the god had eyes. They just took longer to open than I had anticipated, which was the only piece of luck I had that year. The first sign came through Sev. She appeared one evening with a particular attention she got when something in her network had shifted. She sat down, looked at me, and said, "Someone from the temple district is asking questions about the water purification devices." I set down what I was working on. "What kind of questions?" "The kind you ask when you want to find the source of something before you decide what to do about it." I thought about this. A temple asking questions about water purification meant a temple had noticed the lower quarters water was getting cleaner, which meant someone up there was paying enough attention to notice things down here, which was itself already unusual. The lower quarter was not supposed to be interesting to anyone above it. "Which temple?" I asked. She hesitated for half a second, which, from Sev, was the equivalent of a long pause. "Sorth's," she said. Of course it was. I stayed quiet for a moment. Sev watched me with those sharp, deliberately neutral eyes she used when she was deciding how much to say. "You knew who I was before you came to my room," I said. "Not a question." She nodded once. "I suspected." She paused. "It didn't change my decision to come. And I decided it didn't change the calculation. The devices work. The city is better for them. Whatever you have with Sorth stays your business, as long as it doesn't blow back on the people I'm protecting." I appreciated her honesty. I also made a mental note that Sev was always thinking several steps ahead. "It will eventually," I said. "Blow back." "I know," she said. "That's why I've been building contingencies for the past 6 months." She paused. "You should probably start too." I was already building contingencies. I just hadn't told anyone about them yet. Some plans were better when they stay inside one head until the moment they're needed. Here is the thing about gods in this world that most people didn't understand. They weren't omniscient. They were extremely powerful and extremely long-lived, which people interpreted as all-knowing. But they had limited attention. Hundreds of temples, thousands of worshippers, constant demands from the mages who served them. Gods were busy in ways mortals rarely pictured clearly. A god like Sorth was managing an empire's flame infrastructure while running political calculations. For every alliance in the mage nobility, he had killed me once and assumed the problem was solved. It was also the wrong one. But it would take him a while to realize that, and that gap was exactly the window I had been counting on. The second sign came 3 weeks after Sev's warning. I was working late in the forge space when Das came in with a face. That meant something had happened. A temple inspector had come to the lower quarter, not a common mage. One of Sorth's actual clergy had visited the water distribution point, asked questions, looked at the filtration mechanism. "What did they do with it?" I asked. "Took it apart," Das said. "Looked at all the pieces." He paused, then left without saying anything. I nodded. They didn't recognize what it was. Should they have? A mage would expect magic or a divine artifact, I said. They got clay pots and mineral compounds. They probably assumed it was some kind of primitive natural process, which it was, essentially. That was exactly the point. Nature doesn't require a license from the temple. This was, I knew, temporary. The next inspector would be smarter or more curious or bring someone who asked better questions. I had maybe 2 months before Sorth's people understood what they were actually looking at. I had been planning for 1 year. I needed 3 more to be truly ready. I could not get 3 years. So I had to decide what I could actually do with 2 months and build something that would survive without me if it came to that. The answer, when I worked through it carefully that night on the roof of the forge building with the cold air, off the river and the mage lights of the upper city glowing in the distance, the answer was more than you might think. 2 months was enough to double the distribution, to move the knowledge of how to build the simpler devices into enough hands that it couldn't be stopped by simply removing me. That last part was important. I had been doing what I always did when I was personally involved in something. I had been the single point, the source, the only one who fully understood the whole system. That was a critical error, and I had known it was an error, and I had been planning to fix it when I had more time. Now I didn't have more time. I called a meeting, not a large one. Sev, Brix, Das, Ferret, the 5 of us in the back of the forge space with the doors closed and the street sounds of the lower quarter filtering through the walls. I told them everything, not the previous life. That was too much, too strange, and strategically irrelevant to the immediate problem. But everything else. The devices, the principles, the fact that what we were doing had attracted attention from the temple. And then I said, I need each of you to know how to build every device I know how to build. Not most of them, all of them, every single one. Brix nodded as though she had been expecting this. She probably had. Ferret looked at me steadily. Das asked how long it would take. A month, I said. If we work every day. Das looked at me for a long moment. What happens after a month? We expand, I said. Simple as that. I was 13 years old. I had been in this body for 4 years. I had built 47 devices and distributed 23 of them through Sev's network. I had a forge and a team and a plan that was running slightly ahead of my original timeline. I looked at the 4 people in the room who were, functionally, my first recruits. People who had chosen to be here before they understood what here meant. That counted for something. The month that followed was the hardest I had experienced in this life. Not physically, though the work was exhausting, mentally. Because teaching something is fundamentally different from doing it, and I had never properly done the first thing. I understood how everything worked. Explaining how everything worked for different people with 4 different ways of understanding turned out to require me to develop, essentially, a new language. Brix grasped the metalworking elements immediately, and the chemistry elements more slowly. Das was the opposite. Ferret understood structures at a level that sometimes surprised me. Sev, who I had not expected to attend the sessions, showed up to half of them and asked questions that consistently found the weak points in whatever I was explaining. By the end of the month, all 4 of them could build the basic devices without guidance. 2 of them, Das and Ferret, could build the more complex ones with only minor consultation. This was not the same as what I could do. I had 30 years of accumulated knowledge from my previous life plus 4 years of this one. The gap between us was real, but it was enough. If I disappeared tomorrow, the knowledge did not disappear with me. That was what mattered above everything else. The work had to be bigger than one person. I went to the roof of the forge building again. Same cold air, same distant mage lights. I was thinking about the next phase when I heard footsteps on the roof access stairs. Quiet ones. Deliberate quiet, the kind that was trying not to be heard. I did not move. I stayed exactly where I was and waited, the way you wait when you have learned that moving first costs you the information of what moves second. A young woman climbed over the roof edge from the exterior access, the one I had installed as a secondary way out and apparently not hidden well enough. She was maybe 16, a few years older than me. She had the specific look of someone who had been running. She saw me, froze. We looked at each other. You're the device builder, she said. Not a question. She had been looking for me specifically, which meant she already knew the answer. Who wants to know? I said. My name's Iron, she said. I'm from the Western Quarter. She paused, catching her breath. There are temple guards at the bottom of your street. 6 of them. They're not in uniform, but they might as well be. I looked at her for a moment. Why are you telling me? Because the water filter in my neighborhood is the only reason my brother is alive this winter, she said flatly. And I'd like it to keep working. I thought about that. Then I thought about the 6 non-uniform temple guards at the bottom of my street. Then I thought about whether my 2-month estimate had been optimistic. It had been. It appeared somewhat optimistic. 2 months had turned into 2 weeks. That was the kind of math that required immediate recalculation. How did you get here? I asked. Rooftops, she said. I know this part of the city. I grew up here. She looked at me steadily. There's a way out from here that doesn't touch the street level for 6 blocks. I can show you. I looked at her. Calculated. Sev would tell me to verify sources before trusting any information. Sev was also not currently on this roof. The guards, I said. How certain are you? I watched them for 20 minutes before coming up here, she said. They're asking about a 12-year-old boy who fixes things without magic. You seem to be the most likely candidate. She was not wrong about that. I was the only 12-year-old in this part of the city who had any business fixing things without magic, and we both knew it. I had maybe 3 minutes to make a decision, and everything I had spent for years building was either going to survive tonight or it wasn't. I looked at this 16-year-old girl who had run across the rooftops of the lower quarter to warn a stranger because that stranger's work had kept her brother breathing through a cold winter. Then I stood up and picked up the one bag I kept packed for exactly this type of situation. Because I have been doing this long enough to know that one kept bag is not paranoia. It is arithmetic. I looked at her. Show me. She showed me. 6 blocks of rooftops in the dark, moving faster than I would have managed alone, through gaps and across bridges between buildings I would not have found without a guide, who had grown up knowing exactly where they were. We came down into an alley I recognized from message running. Iron pointed left. One more block that way and you're in the textile district. They don't have guards there yet. Yet, I said. It'll spread, she said. Things like this always spread. She looked at me with the directness of someone who had learned to be practical at an age when they shouldn't have had to. What do you need? What I needed was time. What I had was 3 minutes head start and a bag that contained for devices, 2 months of notes, a small amount of money, and the complete written instructions for building everything I knew how to build. The last item was the most important. I had put those pages together in the last week because I had understood, working backwards from the logic of the situation. The running was eventually going to happen. I need to get a message to someone named Sev, I said. Ira nodded immediately. I know Sev. Of course she did. In the lower quarter, everyone who knew anything knew Sev. Tell her the timeline moved up. Tell her to activate the contingency. She'll know exactly what that means. Ira nodded. And you? I'm going to be somewhere else for a while. How long? As long as it takes. Tell Sev the knowledge is distributed. The work doesn't stop. Iron looked at me for a long moment with those steady, practical eyes. How old are you? 13. She shook her head slightly, something between disbelief and something harder to name. Then get somewhere safe, she said. The lower quarter needs you to stay alive. She turned and went back the way we had come, back up into the rooftops, carrying a message I hoped would reach the right person in time. I stood in the alley for exactly the time it took to breathe 3 times and orient myself. Then I turned right instead of left and walked into the dark. I was 13 years old. I had no mana. I had a bag, a plan, and the particular clarity of mind that comes from having expected something bad for long enough that when it actually arrives it almost feels like relief. The god of flame was looking for me. His guards were 6 blocks behind, and somewhere in the lower quarter, for people now knew everything I knew. I walked deeper into the city and started planning what came next. The god of flame was looking for a boy with 0 mana and a bag full of impossible things. He had no idea what he was actually chasing. Drop a comment. What do you think happens when Sorth finally finds out exactly what Kale has been building? I had been to the upper city exactly 3 times before the night I ran, each time as a message runner, in and out before anyone looked twice at me. The upper city was a different world. Same stone, same sky, but the air felt warmer, cleaner, carrying the faint permanent scent of active mana flowing through the walls. The buildings were taller, the light steadier. The people walked with the unhurried quality of those who had never once worried about where their next meal was coming from. I did not go there now. That would be where Sorth's people expected a fugitive to avoid, which meant it was exactly where they would be watching the access points. Instead, I went east, deep into the warehouse district, where the city's import trade ran through loading yards nobody with mana bothered to monitor because there was nothing there worth magic. The warehouse district at night was not comfortable, cold, dark, smelling of old grain and river damp, but it was full of the thing I needed most, places that weren't on any official record. I found an empty building in under an hour. 3rd floor, accessible from a rooftop to buildings over. No visible entry from street level. For years of message running had given me a map nobody official had. The window looked east over the river. I sat down on the floor, put the bag between my feet, and for the first time in days allowed myself to think without moving. Here is the thing about being 13 and on the run from a god. The fear is real, but it is not as large as you might think. I had been preparing for this since the day I woke up in that cell. What I had not fully prepared for was what came after the immediate crisis. I had the bag. I had the knowledge. What I did not have was time. And time is the one thing you cannot build with chemistry. I opened the bag, laid everything out on the dusty floor in the thin moonlight coming through the east window. 4 devices. The best 4. Ones I had not distributed because I had not yet worked out how to explain them without a demonstration. 2 months of notes. Paper carefully folded, written small in a shorthand I had developed specifically so that anyone who found it would need days to decode even what they understood. A small amount of money, not enough to buy passage out of the city, enough to exist quietly for about 3 weeks if I was careful. And the written instructions. 40 pages condensed from 4 years of work, written for someone who had never built anything like this and might need to do it without me present. I looked at those pages for a long time. Then I put everything back, lay down on the dusty floor, and closed my eyes. I was 13. I had been running for an hour. I needed to sleep. I woke before dawn to the sound of someone on the roof to buildings over. Light. Careful. The sound of someone who was trying not to be heard and mostly succeeding. I waited at the window wall, iron bar in hand, and watched the access point. A pair of feet came first, then legs, then the rest of iron. She landed, saw the window, crossed to it in for careful steps. When she saw me pressed against the wall with a bar, she stopped and held up both hands. "Sev sent me," she said quietly. I lowered the bar slowly. "How did you find me?" She gave me the look people give when the answer should be obvious. She gave me a look that managed to be exasperated without making any sound. "You grew up here for years running messages. You know every building. You needed somewhere unregistered and east-facing. There are 11 buildings that fit," she continued. I checked them in order. I thought about that. "You've done this before. I find people for Sev sometimes. Can I come in?" She sat on the floor across from me with the easy comfort of someone accustomed to floors in the dark, produced a small wrapped package of food and a folded note. The food was bread and dried fruit. The note was Sev's handwriting, short, direct, very Sev. I read it twice, folded it, and put it in the bag. "Contingency active. Briggs and Doss are with me. Ferret went east. Guards searched your room. Found nothing. They don't know about the forge yet. You have more time than you think. Stay dark. Wait for signal. 12 of the devices are already in new hands," Iron added. "People she trusts. None of them know where the others are." Sev had built that in from the start. No single point of pressure could collapse the whole network. She was better at this than I was and always had been. "The temple guards," I said. "What are they looking for?" Iron was quiet for a moment. "They're calling it an inquiry into unlicensed magical practice in the lower quarter." "It's not magical." "I know that. You know that. They don't know what to call something that isn't magic and isn't prayer and isn't coincidence. That's actually the problem. They're confused, and confused people with authority escalate until they aren't confused anymore." This was accurate. I filed it under things Sev had probably calculated before sending this message. Sorth himself. I asked, "Is he paying personal attention?" Iron considered, "Not yet. This is still at the clergy level. Nobody has gone to the god directly." That was the window. The gap between a bureaucratic inquiry and a divine one was small but real. I looked at the pre-dawn sky over the river and thought about the problem and its essential structure. I needed the network to grow faster than Sorth's people could understand what it was. If they understood before it was large enough, they could simply suppress it. But past a certain threshold, suppression would cost more than it was worth. What was that threshold? Not a number of devices. A number of people who had personal experience with the devices, enough. That removing them would produce visible, undeniable harm. Not abstract harm. Not theoretical. The kind that made people stop and say, "Something has been taken from us." I was not there yet, but I was closer than I had been 2 weeks ago. "I need 3 things," I said to Iron. She did not take out any writing materials, just looked at me and waited. "Good. First, I need to know if anyone in the warehouse district has regular contact with the middle quarter. Merchants, traders, people who move between levels." Iron nodded once. "Second, the complete layout of the temple district's outer wall. Just the outside perimeter, where the service entrances are. Where deliveries come in." She raised an eyebrow at that one. "That's a more specific request." "I know." "Third, someone who can move through the middle quarter without notice. Someone who doesn't look like they're from the lower quarter." Iron was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How old do they need to be?" I looked at her. She was 16. Old enough to be unremarkable in the middle quarter, if dressed correctly. "You're volunteering," I said. "Not a question." "Sev said you probably need field support." She said to make my own decision about whether to provide it. She paused. "I already made it." I looked at this girl who had run rooftops to warn me and then track me before dawn on the basis of logic and the stubborn competence this city consistently failed to notice in people without mana. "Why?" I asked. Same word I'd asked Sev. Different weight. Iron looked at the east window for a moment. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. "My brother was sick for 2 years," she said. "Lung sickness. The kind the temples cure for a sum of money that takes most families 5 years to save." She was quiet for a beat. "Your water filter reduced contamination in our district enough that his condition improved without any temple treatment at all. He is fine. The temple received nothing." I thought about her brother who was breathing, about the mill owner whose losses had dropped, about all the small specific repairs that added up to something none of them individually contained. And I thought about 30 years of notebooks, about the idea growing since I was still in my first body, watching the world run on power it did not have to run on. "All right," I said, "here is what we're going to do." And then I talked for about an hour, and she did not interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "This is either brilliant or insane." I could tell she genuinely wasn't sure which. Neither was I, completely. But that had never stopped me before. "No," she agreed, "but it matters which one it is." She stood and brushed dust from her clothes with automatic efficiency. Give me 2 days. I sat on the warehouse floor and looked at the 4 devices in the bag. The plan was larger than I had originally intended at 13. The original design was slower, quieter, more cautious. But the timeline had moved. When the timeline moves, you have 2 choices: abandon the plan or accelerate it. I had never been good at abandoning things. The 2 days I spent carefully, not hiding. Hiding was actually more suspicious than moving in a district like this one. I moved instead, slowly, purposefully, in patterns that looked like legitimate warehouse work. Anyone watching from a distance would have seen nothing worth reporting. That was the goal, and on the second afternoon I made a small purchase from a waste jar dealer on the eastern edge of the district. Back at the warehouse I worked through the night, not with my best tools, with what I had, which was, as always, not ideal but sufficient. By morning I had built something I had been designing in my head for 6 months but not yet had occasion to construct. I looked at it in the thin dawn light and ran the calculations twice more. The principle was the same as everything else I had ever built. Not magic, chemistry, pressure. Predictable physical outcomes from predictable physical inputs. The scale was larger than before. I wrapped it in cloth, put it in the bag next to the other devices, and thought carefully about whether what I was planning was necessary. The conclusion was yes. Not because I wanted confrontation, because the alternative was to keep being a problem small enough to crush, and I had burned through the last of my time to be small. On the morning of the second day, Iron came back. She had everything: the perimeter layout to service entrances with rotation schedules, and a middle quarter merchant contact. She also had something I had not asked for: confirmation that Sev's contingency was fully running. 31 devices, in 11 locations. 3 people can now build the basic models without guidance. 31. More than I thought possible in the available time. Sev had been moving faster than I knew. And Sorth? I asked. Iron's expression shifted. It's escalated. The inquiry is no longer at the clergy level. He knows something is in the lower quarter that shouldn't be. He's paying attention now. This was expected. The god would eventually look. The question had always been what he would see when he did. I picked up the bag. Then it's time to stop being invisible. Iron stared at me. That is the opposite of what I expected you to say. I know, but think about it from his perspective. He's looking for a hidden thing, small and concealed. If what he finds instead is something large and in the open, he doesn't have a script for that. People without a script make mistakes. She worked through it the way she had worked through the warehouse logic when tracking me. She was genuinely quick. Seth picked her people carefully. You're going to show him what you're building, she said slowly. Before it's finished. Not exactly. I'm going to make sure that when he looks very soon, and not friendly, what he sees is not a boy hiding in a warehouse. What he sees is a fact, the kind that's already too large to simply make disappear. She was quiet. Then, how long do we have? 2 days, maybe 3. Ira nodded. Then she said, I want the full plan. Not an outline, the full version. Someone else needs to be able to continue it. That's what you told your people in the forge. The knowledge can't live in one head. She met my eyes. You're one head. She was right. I had told for people in the forge and felt the weight lift. There was one more person who needed to know. She had just explained the reason better than I could have. I talked for 2 hours. She asked questions sharp enough to find 3 things I had not fully worked out yet, and honest enough to tell me which they were without softening it. When I finished, the sun was up, and the warehouse district was coming to life with sounds of ordinary commerce. Carts, voices, the distant creak of loading mechanisms. Iron sat with the information for a moment. Then, the thing you built last night, what exactly does it do? I told her. She was quiet for a long moment. Are you certain about the calculations? I ran them 3 times. The outcome is certain. The scale is somewhat new, but the principle has been tested. I paused. It will work. She looked at me with the expression of someone deciding whether to trust a calculation they couldn't verify themselves, deciding yes because the person who made it had not been wrong yet. All right, she said. When do we move? Tonight, I said, after the second bell. She nodded once, then went to wait while I finished thinking. That afternoon, I wrote 3 letters. One to Sev, short, specific, containing exactly what she needed and what to do if things went wrong. One to Bricks, mostly about the forge, nothing sentimental, because Bricks would not have wanted any. And one I folded twice and put at the bottom of the bag without addressing. I did not know yet who it was for. It was the letter that said everything I had been thinking since the night I woke up in a cold cell and decided to start again. About what I actually wanted. Not revenge, not power, Something harder to name and worth more than either. I sealed all three, gave Brix's letter to Iron. Then we waited for the second bell. When it rang, we moved. The night was cold and clear. The kind of cold that makes mage lights look sharper than usual, every lamp edge crisp against the dark. We went through the service entrance Iron had identified, to guards on a rotating shift. She had timed the rotation with precision. We went through in a 6-minute window with 4 minutes to spare. Inside the temple district's outer perimeter, the air was warmer. Mana ran through the walls here the way water ran through pipes elsewhere. I could feel it as pressure, like standing near a large fire that never quite reached you. I had no access to it. That was fine. I did not need it. The delivery entrance to the temple's lower service yard opened twice nightly for supply carts. We slipped in with the tail end of the second delivery, which Iron had confirmed was running at this hour. Inside the service yard, I had approximately 8 minutes before the workers returned. I set up in 4, which left me for minutes to stand back and look at what I had built. Not visually impressive. A clay tube mounted on an iron frame, a measured quantity of compound packed into the base. A timer mechanism built from the same type of spring I had pulled from an old trap in my first week. To anyone without context, broken equipment someone had left in the service yard. What it was a statement. I set the timer. 8 hours, long enough to be well away, short enough to go off in full daylight when the maximum number of people would be watching. Then Iron and I went back out through the service entrance and walked east into the dark. Neither of us spoke for a while. The city moved around us, indifferent. If the calculation is right, Iron said eventually, "What exactly happens tomorrow morning?" I told her, step by step, no softening. The gas is non-harmful. It smells strongly of something the temple mages use in cleansing ceremonies. I designed it that way deliberately. The tube releases it upward in a column approximately 4 meters high, visible from the upper city as well as the lower. It looks like ceremony, but it has no mana signature and cannot be explained as ceremony by any framework the temple uses for explaining things. She was quiet for a moment, and that forces him to pay attention. It forces him to explain it, which he cannot do without understanding what it is. And by the time he finishes understanding that 31 devices are already in use, already seen, already part of what the lower quarter does. We walked for another block in silence. "You're not trying to fight him," Iron said finally. "No," I said. "You cannot fight a god at 13 with no mana and a bag of devices. That's not arithmetic, that's a fantasy." "Then what are you doing?" I thought about how to say it correctly, about the notebooks and the years of calculation, and the day Sorth laughed at me while I was dying and assumed the problem was solved. "I'm making myself too interesting to ignore," I said, "and known to simply erase." Those are two different problems for him. Dealing with a hidden thing is simple. Dealing with a known thing, a thing the city has seen, that people have used, that has a name and a record, that requires a different kind of response, a political one. Iron thought about this for a long time. We were back in the lower quarter now, moving through streets I had run messages on for years, streets that knew my footsteps as well as any place I had ever inhabited. And if the political response is just force? She asked, if he decides it's easier to make an example, then we find out whether 31 devices and for people who know how to build them is enough. I paused, and we learned something about what the next phase requires. She looked at me. "You've already thought about the next phase." "I'm always thinking about the next phase. The current one is just what I'm doing while I plan it." She was quiet for one more block. "Then, you're going to be a problem for him for a very long time, aren't you?" Not a question. She already knew the answer. I thought about the god who had laughed at me the day I died, about the sound of it that low, satisfied, like a man who had just won a bet he had rigged himself from the beginning. "Yes," I said simply. "That is the plan," and I meant every word of it in a way I had not meant anything since I woke up in the dark 4 years ago. We reached the safe house Sev had set up, a room above a tanner's workshop, smelling of leather and chemical compounds. Actually comfortable, for those of us who knew waste yards well. I put the bag down, sat on the bed, which was a significant improvement over warehouse floors. 8 hours from now, in the service yard of Soreth's temple, a column of ceremonial scented gas would rise for meters with no mana signature, and the god of flame would have to decide what to do about a 13-year-old with 0 mana, who had been quietly rebuilding the world under his feet. I lay back, looked at the ceiling, and thought just for a moment about bread baking the streets over, about what you notice when you're dying. Then I closed my eyes. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. What do you think Sorth does when he sees the device go off? Does he come himself, or send someone worse? Drop it in the comments. I was asleep when the device went off. I know because I woke up to the sound of iron on the stairs, moving fast and trying not to. She opened the door without knocking, looked at me, said, "It worked." Then she sat down on the floor, the specific posture of someone processing something large. I sat up outside. The city made its morning sounds. Carts, voices, the upper quarter bell rhythm. Except underneath all of it, something else. A different quality. Not noise, reaction. The sound the city makes when it notices something it does not have a framework for. A sound I had been waiting for. How large was the column? I asked. For meters, she said. Maybe 4.5. The color was off-white, not standard ceremony color. That was the first thing that made people stop. I had designed it that way. Close enough to ceremony to require an explanation. Different enough to be clearly not the temple's doing. How long before they put it out? They didn't. It burned through its compound in about 20 minutes, exactly as you said. By then there were people watching from the upper quarter. 20 minutes of visible, unexplained phenomenon in the temple district service yard, with witnesses from every level of the city. I let that settle. And Sorth. Iron was quiet for a beat. He appeared at the 8th bell, she said. Over the temple, column of fire. Larger than usual. Angry? She considered the word carefully. Not angry. Interested. That was better than angry. Anger was reactive. Interest was something I could work with. I stood up, put on my coat, picked up the bag. Then we moved now, while he's still trying to understand what he saw. Move where? To the place where understanding stops being enough, I said. She stood up without further questions. That was one of her best qualities. We went to Sev. Her current location was a room above a cloth merchant storage. Her third location in for days, which was the kind of operational discipline that had kept her running for 30 years. She opened the door before we knocked, looked at me with the expression she used when events were moving faster than she had planned. The forge, I said. Still intact? Yes. They searched the building twice. Bricks pulled everything to the secondary location before the first search arrived. Where? Sev told me. 3 buildings from where I had spent nights in the warehouse district. I chose to interpret this as Sev being deliberate rather than coincidental. Bricks is there now, Sev said at us, and 11 people from the lower quarter who want to learn to build. She paused. I told them to wait. 11 people. I thought about that number. 4 days ago I had for people who knew the full method. Now I had the outline of a school. Sev had moved considerably faster than the plan allowed for. You moved faster than the plan allowed, I said. The plan didn't account for 31 devices producing results visible enough to create 11 volunteers, she said. I adjusted. Any problems too? First, 3 of the 11 were sent by temple administration. I identified them before they arrived. They are currently helping Bricks with metalwork and do not know I know who they are. You're keeping them. Informed people inside a structure are more useful than excluded ones. They will report what they see. What they see is a woman teaching basic metalwork to interested citizens, which is accurate. Second problem, Sev's expression shifted by approximately 1 degree. For her, that was significant. Sorth's primary clerk sent a formal inquiry to the lower quarter district administration this morning. Not the standard clergy follow-up. A direct inquiry, signed by the clerk personally. I knew what that meant. The clergy level was done. The god was paying direct attention himself. What does it ask for? The name and location of the individual responsible for the device found in the temple service yard. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the lower quarter went about its morning. Somewhere in the warehouse district, Bricks was teaching 11 people. 31 devices were in use across the city. What did administration respond? Sev almost smiled. That they had no record of any such individual and that the lower quarter contained no registered practitioners of unlicensed magical work. Which is technically accurate, I said. Completely. The devices are not magical. Our people are not mages. The inquiry used the wrong legal category. I let myself feel something about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I put it away and thought about what came next. Here is the thing about forcing a god to pay attention. The moment you succeed, the clock changes. Before, I had time measured in months. Now I had something closer to days. Not because gods cannot be patient, they can be extraordinarily patient, which is part of what makes them dangerous. Because I had made a public move, and public moves require public responses. The longer the response took, the more the gap in the record grew. Every day without an official response was a day the lower quarter used devices that officially should not exist. Every week was another layer of practical reality that would be harder to reverse than the one before it. I understood this. Sorth understood this. The question was which of us would move first, and how. I need to be visible, I said. Sev looked at me. How visible? Known, I said. Not hidden, not anonymous. If he's looking for the source of the device, I want him to be able to find it. Iron, standing by the door, said, you want to be findable. I want the answer to the question to already be available before his people find it by other means. That makes you a target, Sev said. I'm already a target, I said. The difference is a hidden target is easier to remove than a known one. She turned that over. I watched her find the same conclusion I had reached 3 days ago in the warehouse. Then she said it. The lower quarter protects its own. If you are known here, named, recognized, someone whose work people have experienced, then removing you is not a quiet, administrative action, I said. It is a visible one, with witnesses. Sev was quiet for a long moment. This is either excellent strategy or a very fast way to die. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Iron made a small sound that might have been a laugh. How long do you need? Sev asked. An hour, I said. 3 things first. She nodded and said nothing more. The first thing was the forge. I went to Brix's secondary space in the warehouse district and spent 40 minutes with Brix and the 11 people she was teaching. I sat down and watched what Brix was doing. Then I showed 2 of them a refinement to the heat device that improved efficiency by about 1/3. I answered questions. I corrected to mistakes in the early build process. I explained the underlying principle to a room of people who had never been told their world had rules they could actually work with. The room was very quiet for parts of the conversation. Then I stood, told Brix what I was planning, and watched her expression move through 3 distinct phases. The first was the look she used when she thought I was making a structural error. The second was the look she used when she had checked and confirmed there wasn't one. The third was something harder to name, and I did not try. You are going to cause an enormous amount of trouble, she said. Yes, I said, I know. She picked up her hammer and went back to work. From Brix, that was the equivalent of a lengthy speech of support. The second thing was the letter at the bottom of my bag, the one I had written without knowing who it was for. I sat on a crate in the cold morning air and read it twice. Then I understood. Not a person, a record. I went back inside and gave it to Sev. Somewhere safe, I said. Somewhere that survives whatever happens today. She took it without reading it. 3 places, she said. I'll use all 3. That was why I had given it to Sev specifically and no one else. The third thing took the longest. I stood in the middle of the lower quarter's main market square for about 10 minutes. Said nothing. Did nothing. Just stood there while people moved around me. People recognized me. Not all of them. I had been careful over for years to stay below general notice. But enough. The woman who ran the water distribution. The cobbler. People who had used the devices. Word spread the way it always does in the lower quarter. Fast, quiet, through the network of people who talked to each other because talking was the only currency some of them had. By the time I had been standing there 20 minutes, a small crowd had formed. Not organized, not summoned, just people who had heard something unusual and walked over to confirm it. I looked at the crowd for a moment. Then I said what was true. I told them my name, Kale, the name I had chosen in this life, with 4 years of work now attached to it. I told them I was the person who had built the devices, all of them, that the devices were not magic, that they worked because of principles anyone could learn, that I had written down and distributed. I told them the principles existed now in enough heads that they could not be unwritten, that the person the temple was asking about was me. I was standing here. I was not hiding. The market square was very quiet. Then the cobbler said, "Where did guards take people they removed from the lower quarter?" Someone else answered him. I didn't. That was the right dynamic. Let the question be public. Let the answer be public. Let the consequence be a thing the market square discussed openly on its own. Let Sword's clerk read about it from 6 different accounts and understand what the territory looked like now, what it had become while he was asking the wrong questions. I walked out of the square and went back to Sev's location. There was nothing more to do there. The square would do the rest without me. Sev was there. Iron was there. Briggs had arrived and was in the corner with something hot, watching me with the expression of someone waiting for the next development. 11 people from the market square are standing outside this building, Sev said. Not doing anything, just standing. She paused. They followed you here. Tell them they can go home. I did. They said they'd rather not. Iron was looking out the window. They're not here for you specifically. You said your name in public. Nobody does that. That was both accurate and the entire point. Not power.presence.I exist. I have a name. People know what I built. That is a different problem than a nameless source of unlicensed phenomena. By midday, the number outside was closer to 30. By the third bell, Sev's network confirmed what I had been expecting. Sorath's clerk had formally withdrawn the inquiry. Not closed, not resolved, withdrawn, suspended pending further review from higher authority. Meaning the clerk had taken the situation back to the god himself. Meaning I now had a direct line between my name and a god's personal attention. With the lower quarter as the intermediary, Sev handed me the confirmation. I read it, folded it, put it in the bag. What does he do next? Iron asked. Wait, I said. He'll want to understand the full scope before he moves. That's what intelligent beings do when they encounter something new. He'll send people, Sev said. Probably already has. Yes, let them come. Let them see the forge. Let them count the 31 devices in use. Let them do their arithmetic and bring it back to Sorath. Iron looked at me. You're not afraid of him. Somewhere between an observation and a question. I thought about being honest. I am afraid of him. He killed me once already. That leaves an impression. But fear and caution are not the same thing. And caution is not the same as paralysis. You can be afraid and still calculate. What do you calculate? I looked at the window, at the people standing in the street, at the city beyond them with its mage lights and its lower quarter and its 31 devices doing quiet, reliable work. In about 6 months, if the teaching at the forge continues, enough people will know how to build the basic devices that the knowledge cannot be removed by any action short of destroying the city. After that, in about a year, the devices will have been in use long enough that removing them produces the kind of harm that creates the kind of politics that even gods have to calculate. And after that, I said, the conversation changes. It stops being about suppressing something new. It becomes about what to do with a fact that already exists. Sev looked at me for a long time. You planned to this point from the beginning, before the forge, before me, before bricks, from the first night in Valith, I said. On the wall behind the cooperage, with a piece of borrowed chalk. She was quiet. Then she said something I had not expected. What happens to you in this plan of yours? What do you become at the end of it? I had thought about this more than about anything else. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I know what I'm building. I know roughly the shape of what I'm building toward. What I become in it depends on what he decides. Sorath, yes, and if he decides on force, then I become the person who survives it or doesn't, I said. Either way, the knowledge survives. That was always the point. Sev nodded once. From her, that was significant approval. The afternoon passed quietly. The people outside cycled through. Some left, more arrived. Nobody did anything except exist visibly in a public street. By evening, the forge had 12 new students. 3 people in the middle quarter had sent quiet inquiries through intermediaries asking whether the devices could be purchased for commercial use. That last part one found particularly interesting. Commercial interest meant the middle quarter was watching. The middle quarter watching meant merchants were watching. Merchants were the connective tissue between the lower city and the upper one. Accept the inquiries, I told Sev, with conditions. Any merchant who buys a device agrees to have their staff trained in the basic principles. Not just that they work. How? You're using commercial interest to spread the knowledge sideways, Sev said slowly, into the levels of the city that have resources to build faster and at better quality than we can manage from the lower quarter. She was quiet. You thought of this years ago. Yes. Iron, at the window. The middle quarter merchants will eventually realize this could undercut the temple's monopoly on infrastructure. Yes. That is when things get interesting. Interesting meaning dangerous. Interesting meaning the calculation changes for everyone, including Sorath. By the time the evening bell rang, I had placed a visible device in a god's temple, set my name in a public square, and started a school for applied non-magical science. I had also opened a line of commercial interest that would make the devices part of the city's middle economy within a year. Not bad for 13. I sat down on the floor of Sev's room. The chairs were occupied by people working, which had become a permanent feature of any room I spent time in, and ate some bread Briggs had brought. Iron was at the window. She spent a lot of time at windows. It was how she gathered information without appearing to gather it. The people in the street, she said without turning. They're going to go home tonight. Most of them. They have lives. I know. I said. Some will come back tomorrow, she said. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. You're not worried that Sorath just appears tonight while we're sitting here eating bread? He won't, I said. Not tonight. A god who appears in the lower quarter the night after withdrawing an inquiry sends a specific message. He is not ready to send the message yet. How do you know? Because I know what he knows. He killed me once and thought the problem was solved. Now the problem has a name, a location, 30 devices in distribution, and commercial interest from his merchant class. You don't solve it by appearing at night. We keep building, I said simply. She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I noticed. Then she said something quietly. You're going to win this. Not today, not this year, but eventually. I looked at the bread in my hand, at the room full of people working. Define when, I said. She thought about it. The world runs differently because of what you built, because of what the people you taught built, because of the thing that cannot be untaught. She paused. That's what you mean by when? Yes, I said. That's exactly what I mean. Outside, the lower quarter made its evening sounds. In the forge, metal was being worked. Across the city, 31 devices were running quietly, without prayer, without mana. And a god was thinking very carefully about a 13-year-old with zero magic and a piece of borrowed chalk who had decided, 4 years ago in a cold dark cell, that the most dangerous thing in the world was not power. It was a good idea, written down, placed in enough hands that it could not be unwritten. That was always the most dangerous thing. That was always the plan. I finished the bread, lay down with my coat as a pillow, closed my eyes. There was still so much to build. That was not a worry. That was the best possible version of tomorrow. I went to sleep looking forward to it. If you were Sorth, knowing everything you know about Kale now, what would your next move be? Think carefully. Drop it below.